Thank you for coming to the GRCC tonight. And welcome to this program on the International Day of Peace. I don't know how many of you understood that September 21 every year is the International Day of Peace. And we at the World Affairs Council have come to be eager for a program. And what better partner to have than the United States Institute of Peace? Perfect. So we're glad you're here. I'm Michael Vendetta, and I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. And along with my colleagues, Rachel Brooks and Erica Kubik, thank you so much for coming and being with us. And thank you to those who are watching online as well. We're pleased to host this event at Grand Rapids Community College. They've been such terrific partners, and we're really thankful for them. Our faculty liaison, Mike DeVivo, our video producer, Class Quant, and all their colleagues. They've really been great supporters of what we do. It is the Council's mission to empower the people and organizations of Western Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this with the help of 11 colleges and universities and almost 50 corporate members all over West Michigan. And we just believe that to change the world, you first have to know the world. And that's what we do. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. We're glad to host Maria Antonia Montes, Tonis as she can be called, and she is a senior program officer of the Gandhi-King Global Academy at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. We're also glad to welcome Lana Lancaster, who's here from USIP as well. She is the director of their higher education engagement program, and it's great that she was in the Midwest and she was able to come as well to be with us. Thank you both, and thank you so much for what USIP does. We're big fans of your organization here in West Michigan. This evening's presentation will be a moderated conversation between Ms. Montes and also Dr. Max Counter. And he is the Latin Americanist at the Integrated Studies Program at Grand Valley State University. They're going to have some conversation, and after their initial conversation, we have a microphone around, and we want to hear from you. They want to hear from you, and we'll have a Q&A around. We'll also do that with our remote listeners, and we'll have them let us know on the Council YouTube channel chat box, and we'll get their questions involved as well. So I invite our guests here up front to introduce themselves a little bit more fully and then start our conversation.
Am I on? All right, great. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Max Counter. I hold a PhD in human geography from the University of Colorado, and I'm currently an affiliate professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State. For about just over a decade now, I've been working on human rights issues in Colombia, focusing on topics like reparation programs for landmine victims, the legal processes through which displaced rural communities try to recuperate the land that they've had stolen from them during war. My current research looks at how Colombian institutions right now are grappling with the question about whether or not to label certain parts of Colombia's conflict as constituting genocide or not. So with that background in human rights, and especially in Colombia, it's really my pleasure tonight to speak with Tonis, and I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Great. Thank you, Max. And thank you to all of you here in person and also online for coming to this event and for this warm invitation. And welcome to West Michigan and to Grand Rapids. Antonia Montes. I'm a senior program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm a Latin Americanist as well, and studied political science with a focus on Latin American studies. My family is from Colombia, so I have deep personal ties to Colombia and to the region, and then ended up studying conflict resolution and peace building in my advanced studies. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you, Max.
Great. Well, and thanks for making the trip to Michigan.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. So I felt like to start off tonight's conversation, some folks here might have a degree of familiarity with the United States Institute of Peace, or USIP, but for folks who are maybe newer to the organization, if you wouldn't mind just starting off by telling us a little bit about what is USIP's mission, and what are some of the broad ways they try to implement that mission?
Yeah, great question. So the U.S. Institute of Peace is an independent, nonpartisan National Institute, which was created and founded by Congress 40 years ago. A lot of Vietnam veterans who were senators who came back from Korea and Vietnam and World War II, in fact, had created a bill in Congress to create a peace institute. The United States was really good at creating conflict and war and participating in those wars, but these senators came back from that experience and said, we need to demonstrate the US's commitment to peace building abroad. So through that, there's an act of legislation that was ratified and turned into a bill by President Reagan, and so USIP is 40 years old. We are held accountable to Congress. We're part of the legislative branch, and we serve the interests of the American taxpayer with our work overseas. And so we really focus on peace building and peacemaking. USIP works around the globe. We have 16 offices around the globe. Our headquarters are in DC. And so we have a focus on Latin America, which is the area where I work, but we also have work in the Middle East and North Africa, Asia, Russia, and Europe. And so we're all over the world. And we don't have an explicit domestic mandate here in the US. We can't do work explicitly in the United States context, but we do have these programs for public education and higher education engagement to exchange and share with the American public about what it is that we do, why the US has a commitment to peace building and why that's important. So that's a little bit about USIP.
All right, great. Well, what a fantastic introduction. And it sounds like USIP is quite everywhere, a presence everywhere. So, just as a small clarification, you mentioned this, that USIP was, founded by an act of Congress and it's funded through Congress, but it has, if I'm understanding correctly, a certain degree of autonomy from Congress, or what is the relationship like in that sense?
Yeah, so we are part of the legislative branch, and so we do inform and share with members of the House and with the Senate what it is we're doing. If we can inform what our findings are with the work that we do. And so independent of who is in the White House, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, USIP continues its mandate of peace building. So because we're not part of the executive, we don't have the same sort of policy objectives that the Department of State or USAID might have, whoever is in the White House. So that lets us continue kind of this independent, really principled process and approach for peace building around the world.
Great. Well, and now that we have kind of a sense of USIP as an organization, I think it'd be great to hear a little bit more about you, Tonis. So if you wouldn't mind telling us, how did you find your way into peace work?
Yeah. So I mentioned my family is from Colombia, and I grew up going there as a kid. And so that was, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, where there was a civil war, armed conflict that was ongoing. That armed conflict has now lasted 70 years. And for me, as a kid growing up and going to visit my family, I heard a lot of narratives of conflict and war. And so I didn't really understand what that meant when I was growing up. Then once I got to college, I went to a liberal arts university, started taking courses in political science around international negotiations, about the politics of forced migration, and really started to understand what that meant. And then I understood also that the other side of the coin, that there were efforts around peace building. So even in the absence of a peace process, even in the midst of armed conflict, civil society and people were working towards peace. And that really kind of piqued my interest. And so I remember my senior year thesis in undergrad was on internal migration, IDPs in Colombia, and what that meant. And so then I ended up going to Colombia and living there for a couple of years and got my advanced degree in conflict and peace studies. And again, I didn't really know what jobs you could do with that. And so I was like, what do you do for peace? What is the job title? And so I thought maybe the Foreign Service and going to, become an ambassador, if that was the only route that was available to me. It was really trial and error. in DC, networking as is the business of the day in DC, to really try to figure this out. And I had read a lot of special reports and studies that USIP had published, a lot of its research when I was in grad school. So I had known of the organization. And there was a small program on Columbia working with women mediators. And so I applied to that position, and that's how I got to USIP. I've been there now for almost 9 years, so it was a good fit. But again, it's hard when you're young and you're exploring things like, what does that mean practically? How do you create that into a career or a profession?
Yeah, there's no simple paths, we would say, into this work.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you mentioned working with peace movements in Colombia, and I want to come back to that in just a moment. But first, if you wouldn't mind, I think this might be the hardest question to ask because you have so much experience and expertise, but there's so many different ideas and philosophies about what peace means. So based on your experiences, if you had to say like, what really is peace?
Yeah.
I know we're being philosophical here. But
yeah.
What is it?
It's a really good question. I think peace to a lot of people sounds really abstract and really nebulous. Like, what does peace building look like, tangibly? And so in the kind of the peace building literature in the field, we talk a lot about negative peace and positive peace. And I'm sure you've done the same kind of literature review. And when we talk about negative peace, we're just talking about the absence of war and violence, like end human suffering, like full stop. And so that's one way to look at what peace is, just like no violence, physical or otherwise, for a person. And then the positive peace approach really thinks about more structural and systemic violence. And it really has a lens towards social justice and more long-term vision of democratic institutions and economic opportunity. And so when I think of peace and peace building, I think about it in the positive peace frame. I think it's probably also context specific, but if I think about peace building in the context of the United States, there have been a lot of social movements in the past couple of years, and I think those are really a testament to positive peace and social justice campaigns. So if you are interested in social justice issues and advancing important issues that you care about, I would say that you are likely a peace builder. Maybe you don't call yourself that, maybe you don't think around in those frames, but that's, I think, ultimately what we're all trying to do, find that kind of social justice and sustainable peace.
Fantastic answer, and very, expansive, in how we might think about peace as being more than just, like you said, the absence of sheer physical violence. Mm-hmm. I would say then, the title of the talk tonight, it mentions, women and youth in peace movement specifically. So I'd like to ask you a little bit kind of about your experiences in that frame as well. So if you maybe wouldn't start off by talking about a project you've been involved in or something about the specific role that youth might play in promoting effective peace policies.
Yeah. So when I started at USIP, I was working with someone who was a gender expert. And so all of our work had a gender focus in terms of women's inclusion, participation. And when I was just starting out in my career and had that kind of perspective, it really marks the way in which you do your work from there on out. And so I think that you can't unsee what inclusion or participation looks like when that's how you start out your career. So I mentioned when I first started at USIP, we were working on a project to strengthen and elevate the role of women mediators in Colombia. This was in 2015 that we were working on this project, and it was in the context of a peace process that was ongoing between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces Colombia, FARC. Maybe some of you have heard that acronym. And so in the peace process, in that negotiation architecture, there was a very explicit interest in having more women participate, both as negotiators and also through civil society, through delegations that could participate in the peace talks. And so that's the kind of national level context that's happening. But USIP knew that women were playing really important roles for decades. They were negotiating with armed commanders to make sure their children weren't illegally recruited into the FARC or other armed groups. There were women, Afro women, who were collectively defending their land rights and their access to farm. And so women were already doing this work. And so we were trying to create, we as USIP were trying to create this bridge between what was happening at the national level with the peace process and what we knew was already happening at the local level, how these women were mediating immediate conflicts and disputes within their communities with other armed actors. And so that's kind of tangibly how USIP plays that linking role in a peace process, in a really elite and political process, by ensuring that all voices are heard and considered. There's empirical evidence that says that when women participate in peace processes, it has a higher chance of succeeding and a higher chance of durability in the long run. And so women are 50% of the population in any given context. And so I think that evidence alone should tell us that women should be participating in public spaces and in decision-making spaces. And so, women's inclusion, you see that all over the place, not just in Colombia and Latin America, but in Afghanistan and Liberia. There have been massive social movements for women's rights and women's inclusion in these spaces. And then I think for youth, it's another thing. You can't unsee youth. And I think a lot about Colombia's current president, Vice President, Francia Marquez, who is the first Afro-Colombian woman to hold that office. And when she was 16, she was a rural woman, young woman, she's 16 years old, and fighting for the environment and the river, the Cauca River, in her community. And so that 16-year-old ended up becoming the vice president of Colombia. And so we know that peace is a process. It's really generational. And so I think there has to be a profound investment in young people, because we always say this, young people are the future leaders, but they are truly the future leaders. They will hold elected offices. And so if you can catch them when they're young and just starting this work, then they have tremendous opportunities for success. We have a project right now that Alana and I are working on called Participatory Action Research, PAR. And participatory action research actually comes historically from Colombia through sociologist Fals Borda. And it was a way in which Fals Borda engaged with community, campesino, and peasant communities to be creators and generators of knowledge. A lot of research, as we know, happens sometimes from the ivory towers, really extractive processes, and really processes that aren't participatory, where researchers come, take information from the community, churn it out somewhere else, and it never comes back to the community to find local solutions to those issues. So we're really trying to create a paradigm shift of how research is done. And so we're working with 20 young people in Colombia, mostly rural, mostly Afro. And it's been incredible because they've been, given these tools of forum theater or world cafes, different tools to collect information from different stakeholders, from private sector, from local authorities to social leaders. And so they're using these tools to say, how is social investment, or the lack thereof, forcing young people to migrate away from their homes? Is it forced migration? Is it voluntary migration? But what are those factors that are leading to youth migration from rural areas to urban centers? So it's been incredible because a lot of these young people that we're working with find and see themselves as researchers and identify as researchers. And so they're like, maybe I had these skills all along, but now I feel really empowered to use them. And it's not just a now process. I can use this once this program ends and into my organization or whatever it is I'm doing. And so I think providing those types of skills and capacities to young people, again, really allows them to take that into whatever direction they want to. And again, really kind of transformational for these younger generations.
Right. And younger generations who've had the weight of war on their shoulders for decades,
Yeah,
or inheriting a conflict that they didn't start but are kind of obligated to try to fix.
exactly.
And backing up, first off, thank you for those answers.
Yeah.
And backing up a little bit to when you were speaking about the role of women, you mentioned that there's a lot of empirical evidence that when women are involved in the peace processes, those peace processes are more effective and they last longer.
Mm-hmm.
If we could just revisit that point, or like, what are some of the specific reasons why that's the case?
I think what the evidence tells us around women's participation is that women generally put issues on the table that men aren't thinking about. So you get a bunch of like elite white political men into the space, and they're talking about disarmament and giving arms back and ceasefires and cessation of hostilities, like really like hard stuff, and power sharing arrangements or things that keep them in power. And women are talking about like, well, what's the access to the market going to look like when we're growing our crops? And I'm a woman head of the household, and so what is going to happen in terms of getting land rights for me as a woman? And so I think when women start talking more nuanced about the ways in which they're affected by both the conflict and implementation of these agreements, or like rural development or whatever it might be, it really opens the aperture of what needs to be negotiated. And so when women, and there's also a lot of empirical evidence about how women can plug into these really elite spaces. There are different inclusion modalities that have been studied that are more effective, and inclusive commissions like the gender subcommission in the FARC process is the inclusion modality that has the most impact on the peace process. And so I was just talking to a colleague who works specifically on inclusion and negotiations, and she was just sharing that with me. And I found it so interesting that if you're a negotiator and you really want to open the aperture and be like, all of these stakeholders and voices matter, like we all have to coexist in like day after, then you really need to make sure that all of those voices and perspectives are taken into account.
And so kind of when everything that you're saying, right, all this research, this isn't just, hypothetical, and it's not something that's abstract for you. You're in Colombia on a fairly regular basis doing this work on the ground. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, like when you go to Colombia, I'm sure there's no days ever the same, but what are your experiences like when you're on the ground doing this type of work?
Yeah, no day is ever the same. I mean, I think I have the luxury of, I live in DC. I can get to Colombia in like 5 hours. I can get to Bogota, and so that's why I can travel so often. And so, if I'm been in Bogota, then maybe I'm having meetings with the U.S. Embassy or USAID or our partners in Bogota that are our implementing partners and our strategic partners. And Bogota feels like DC, it feels like New York City. It's a very big urban center. And, it feels very kind of routine, meeting heavy. But when I'm really doing the work is when I go to rural communities. And I think you know this from your own research about how much changes when you leave Bogota, and really how the language and the discourse and the perspectives change from rural communities who have been affected by the violence. Bogota can be very analytical. It can feel very distant, from what's actually happening, where communities are under threat every day, and it's from this armed group and this armed group, and they're stuck in the middle, and so they really don't have a recourse. And so it's every community, I would say a lot of municipalities in Colombia have experienced the conflict very differently by nature of their geography, by nature of the armed group that it was there, and so by the population as well, indigenous or Afro. And so I think that no one municipality feels different to me, but I mean, you're going to places where you have to land a small plane in a jungle, and you don't have cell service there, and there is no police station, there is no infrastructure. I'm thinking Bohaja, that experienced a horrific massacre 20 years ago. And you're like, how can I have been in Bogota, flight away, an hour away, and then come to this stark reality of the inequity that can exist in the same country? And so that's where you see the need, and that's where you see also the commitment. I mean, these are the communities and the people most affected by the violence who are the most committed to finding peace as well. They show up to the meetings, they want answers, they want to find resolutions to their issues, and they're there day in and day out, even though there are risks to their lives. And so it's just it's a really humbling experience to be able to work and accompany these communities in their processes.
Well, and based on everything that you just described, right, the horrific reality of this armed conflict, which, as you mentioned, is now in its 7th decade, it makes sense that USIP has had a long focus or presence in Colombia, but it's my understanding that USIP is also kind of expanding its vision throughout Latin America and is implementing new venues for research and advocacy in Latin America. And so would you mind telling us a little bit about how USIP is kind of expanding in the region or taking on new projects?
Sure. So when I started at USIP 8 years ago, we just had the Colombia program in Latin America. We're just one country, 2 of us working on that issue. And since then, probably in 2018, 2019, we started working in Venezuela, next door neighbor to Colombia, and we thought we can't talk about peace in Colombia without recognizing the political and humanitarian situation in Venezuela, how that was affecting Colombia through mass migration of Venezuelans, how Venezuela was also harboring guerrilla groups Colombian guerrilla groups in Venezuela. And so we started anchoring our work between Colombia and Venezuela. Then we started growing a bit more, and so now we're doing work in Bolivia, Nicaragua. So those are the 4 countries that I mostly focus on and have programs in. And then we started working in northern Central America, so Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and we just added Haiti. So in the span of 8 years, we've gone from a 1-country portfolio to an 8-country portfolio in Latin America. And I think that's also, I think foreign policy has changed a bit in the last couple of years, where there was always an outlook to the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, the wars there, whether they were successful or not. I think the perspectives from Congress and this particular administration have now started looking to our neighbors in the South. Congress has an interest in the issues of migration from northern Central America. The Biden administration has an explicit public policy or foreign policy objective in Central America. And so I think that shift is really probably a lot of different factors that have contributed to that growth in the region. And so it's incredible to say that a small organization like USIP, it's around 400 people who work at USIP, have been able to grow such a large presence in the region.
Tackling essentially maybe the hardest problems that exist.
Yeah, maybe the hardest problems. Right. I'm just waiting for them to tell us to add Mexico and Brazil and Peru, but so far we're keeping with our 8 countries.
So they haven't asked you to fix everything
yet,
no. But they're getting, okay, yeah.
Not yet.
So this might be, again, kind of a trickier question, and it's a little bit speculative, but, as we talked about, USIP, it's funded through Congress. It has certainly a degree of autonomy, but especially throughout Latin America, U.S. foreign policy historically has gone through some pretty dark moments, right? We can point to several episodes of the United States working to overthrow democratically elected governments. We can point to United States support for brutal military dictatorships throughout the region. We can point to militaries in Latin America with horrific human rights records whose officers have been trained in the United States. So the United States is a very complicated presence in Latin America, especially. And I'm wondering if in your role as a peace worker, you've ever had to navigate tensions on the ground with people who for maybe somewhat justifiable reasons, don't really see the United States as a fountain of peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good and complicated question. I think that if you're in this work of peace building, and if you're working with an organization with the US at the front of your name, that there has to be a lot of understanding of that history. And there has to be a lot of humility in recognizing that there were decisions that were made that, you know, for better or for worse, changed the outcome a lot of these countries. And so, you know, there's some contexts where we work where we partner with organizations and we don't say we're working with them, or they don't say that they're working with us. Because it would remove all credibility of the type of work that they're doing, or it would be misperceived, or maybe a regime could use it to be like, oh, you're working with the US Institute of Peace? Sure. You know, like that sounds like CIA or some other kind of organization that has an ulterior motive. And so I think knowing the context matters, and the history of that place. And I also think that working with partners so that they can tell us what works and what doesn't work. If they say, listen, in Bolivia, don't even bother saying your name and we don't want your logo anywhere, then I'll be like, that's right. Like you tell us what works and what doesn't work, and we will take your lead. And so I think that is not just in Latin America, but I think that's likely true in other contexts. And so it's hard, I think it's hard to navigate. But again, I think that humility is important, and the recognition that, you know, we might not have things right in our own backyard. And so, you know, bringing that into the conversation to our partners and telling them, you know, we might not have it right, but these are things that we can learn from each other to get it right. Yeah.
The importance of collaboration,
Yeah.
you might say. All right. Well, it looks like we have time for one more question from me before we open it up into the audience. And so, you know, I do see a lot of young faces, right? People here who might be interested in, you know, doing the type of work you're doing. So for those folks in the audience, especially our students, what are some of the things you would suggest, like if they were interested in this work, the skills for them to develop, or what do you need to do to?
Yeah. So I would say for the students in the crowd who are interested in maybe getting into international relations or kind of international peace efforts, I studied political science, and I think having that background in politics, comparative politics, institution building, nation building, that sort of thing was really helpful just for conceptual frameworks of what works, what doesn't work, what has been tried. I also think that learning a language is important. And so if you have the opportunity to learn a language, I think that would help tremendously in your work. And the other thing I would say is to go abroad in any sort of capacity. There are dozens of ways to get abroad through scholarship. There's the Fulbright Scholarship, there's Peace Corps. You can do something like I did, volunteering through World Teach. There are a lot of different ways to really immerse yourself in a new culture and really get to learn and grow with that community to see, like, what are their needs? How are they viewing the world that is different from what I have known all my life? So I would say that, at least for me and the people that I work with, those are the things that I think really help. And so I think just being curious and having good questions, and every organization's different, so you'll learn, you know, different skills for managing projects, and everyone has different ways of doing things in an organization. But I think that if you have those, that grounding kind of foundation, then those are the things that can really help you in your path.
Well, thank you so much for everything you've shared so far. Fascinating conversation, and thankfully we have the chance to keep it going. But now it's, of course, time to hear from the audience. So if you're in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We have a microphone. Mike's got a microphone. He can bring it around. And for those of you watching on our YouTube channel, you can type your question into the chat box. And for those of you in person online, you may also text your question to 616 308 6560. And as always, we just ask for folks to please exhibit civility, of course, to our guests, and hospitality to others, in keeping your questions respectful and succinct. So again, let's open it up.
Good evening. Thank you for your perspective. I was wondering how exactly this peacemaking that you do work. Right? I'm a little bit familiar with the Peace and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, right? Some work on restorative versus retributive justice in Rwanda. So, what are the techniques and strategies that you use in Latin America or Colombia in specific?
Yeah. So we at USIP talk about, I guess, a couple of key pillars to peace building work. And I think one way to think about peace building is what happens kind of at the grassroots community level, kind of what we say like track 3 processes. And then there's like track 1 processes that are like the more political elite levels of negotiation and or dialogue. And so kind of the 3 main peace building tools in our toolkit are dialogue. That can be national dialogues where the entire country is going through some sort of consultation process, or multi-stakeholder dialogues at the community level. We talk about mediation, having an external country or organization like the UN coming in to help resolve a conflict or find solution to that conflict. Or negotiation, a direct negotiation, which is what happened in Colombia, where the FARC and the government sat down face to face and negotiated a 6-point agenda. And so for USIP, what that looks like, whether it's in Latin America or elsewhere, is to provide maybe comparative approaches to doing things, helping with process design, like how do you do like a sequential process that is participatory, that is inclusive, that considers a lot of different elements, technical advice, maybe on gender inclusion or on religious engagement. And so we try to take all of our lessons learned from different contexts and countries and share those across different places and spaces. So concretely, I mentioned Colombia has become a reference point for women's inclusion and women's participation as negotiators in the FARC peace process. And in 2019, in Afghanistan, there had been kind of a 2-track negotiation happening with the US withdrawal and then an intra-Afghan dialogue that would happen between the government and the Taliban. And so in 2019, we brought a group of 3 women from Colombia who had been part of the negotiation to meet with 20 Afghan women who would likely become the negotiators of their process, to really share strategies of how women were engaging in, talking about different points of the agenda. And so, you can look at Colombia and Afghanistan and say, like, have nothing in common, which is true. But they have the through line in that is how women can meaningfully participate in a negotiation. And that exchange of experiences, I think, is one of USIP's added value, is that we can go and exchange across different contexts to share best practices and lessons learned. Thank you.
Hey, I'll bring the microphone back, but I want to ask about a question a country you haven't talked about yet, that's dear to my heart. What about Haiti? It seems absolutely impossible to even start a peace process.
Yeah. Maybe, do you want me to catch this one or answer? Okay. So
Impossible question.
Haiti was included in a congressional kind of fragility, the Global Fragility Act. I think there are 8 countries in that Global Fragility Act, and Haiti was one of them. I'm not following Haiti closely, but I do see what is in the news right now in terms of the levels of gang violence, the control that gangs have in Port-au-Prince, and the effect that is having on the economy, on the rule of law, on opportunities. And so I don't know if I have the solution of how you engage or negotiate in that climate or environment, but I do think that transformation and pressure happens at the civil society level. And I think that if civil society is organized, if they find a common kind of North Star, they can really apply pressure on the international community, on whomever might be their officials, elected or otherwise, to really try to advance some sort of political solution or political transition. And so I think a lot, if we can't depend on local officials, if there's no other recourse, what else do you have? And I think that's the strength of organizing through civil society and grassroots efforts.
So my question was, how difficult is it to navigate through your field of work when you're under a presidency that isn't willing to cooperate with your mission?
Like maybe a government in another country?
That or even in the US. Like, for
US.
example, we have a president that wants to close borders, cut all negotiations and ties with other countries. Like, how would you navigate through that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier USIP is congressionally funded, and whoever is in the White House, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, who might have certain policy objectives or priorities, USIP is still a principled and independent organization. And so we have an explicit mandate to work on peace building and peacemaking issues. Everything is political, even peace is political. But I would say that if we are true to that mission and to that objectives, independent of who is in office here in our country, we still have that mandate, and there are still willing partners in Colombia or in other countries for us to do that meaningful work. That's not to say it's not hard. I mean, even navigating Congress with so much change and transition in Congress can be difficult. But I think maintaining that kind of principled objective on what we're doing and being transparent about what we're doing and communicating that with our colleagues at the State Department and USAID and to the Hill, then we are doing our job. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for sharing your insights with us. Me, as a faculty from Latin America teaching in the US, something I try to bring to all my classes is I try to expand my students' horizons of the world, what's going on beyond the US borders. And so I do bring what Max mentioned earlier, the role of the US in weakening democracies throughout Latin America. And I find a lot of resistance from my students. And so my question is, to what extent teaching, learning, remembering, bringing to awareness this history plays a role or should play a role in peace building, and in particular in regards to this new phase of USIP in expanding to the public through reaching out to universities, community colleges. I don't know what role does learning about this history plays there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in institutions of higher education, I benefited a lot from having professors and teachers who were really forthright about the really dark parts of U.S. history in terms of our engagement with other countries in conflict or in other contexts. And so I think, again, I say humility is the word, of really recognizing and accepting and having difficult conversations. I mean, even a lot of peace building is having difficult conversations of exclusion, of marginalization, of grievances. And so I think that we will probably can do a disservice to our students when we don't really address and attack that head on, because the reality of our world and the contexts and the problems that we're facing are just so difficult that when students are coming out of college or high school or whatever, they're going to be confronted with a really complex world, and without having those conversations. And I understand probably where the resistance comes from, that I think we should all be prepared about because there are much more existential challenges that we'll be facing in the future related to the climate. And so when you have those types of existential issues that you have to talk about and grapple with, I mean, I think it's just a part of our jobs, and hopefully that will inform and influence how we do our peace building work.
Over here? Okay.
Hi.
Thank you for coming. Colombia is such a beautiful country. And like you said, people just crave peace, the way they're talking there. Do you have any on the grassroots level, any like little examples or little victory stories of specific things that people on the grassroots were able to peacefully negotiate, or some of the challenges, with the things that they're dealing with the economy, with drug trafficking, with ethnic tensions, things like that? Just a couple little, an example or two of something that they were able to, on a grassroots level, accomplish.
Yeah. Well, so I might start one anecdote of a young peace builder that I'm working with currently through our program on participatory action research. She is a young woman from a very rural community, and she's Afro-Colombian, and has had very limited opportunities to engage, I think, in peace building work and engage with local authorities and really demonstrate her leadership as a young Afro woman. And so we've been working with her to build her capacities in research, to develop her capacities in data analysis, and really have her engage with her community on issues related to social investment and youth migration. And so recently we invited her to a panel. And so she revealed in that panel that she was like, I didn't know that I was a peace builder. I didn't know I was doing this work. And so for her, it was like this incredible kind of light bulb moment where she felt incredibly empowered and transformed. And she's, just a 20-year-old, not just, but she's a 20-year-old young woman, and she has this incredible, I think, new vision about what she can do for her community in a way that she might not have had otherwise, or may have had otherwise, but maybe didn't have the tools to do that work. And so for me, like, that's what peace building is. Like, how can we transform the vision and the approach of one person, and that can have a ripple effect into a community, and that can have a paradigm shift in a society. So that's one anecdote. I think another anecdote that I would share is we talked a lot about Colombia today, but we haven't talked as much about Venezuela. And so again, another program that I've been working on is women's participation in political spaces in Venezuela, and also bringing in capacities on UN Resolution 1325, which calls for women to be at the forefront of peace and security issues. And so my colleague, whom I've been working with in Venezuela now for 5 years, has been leading dialogue work in really, really violent and also very poor communities in Venezuela, in Caracas. And so she's been able to go into these really poor neighborhoods where young kids are being recruited by criminal gangs and other issues, to really recreate the social fabric of that community and build dialogue and trust and ask questions like, why are we going into these criminal groups? Like, what do you need to not go into those groups? And so again, this for me is what peace building is, that one person has the skills and the knowledge and the concepts and the frames and the courage to really begin a process in their community to change the way in which they live. That's their day-to-day life, that's their day-to-day neighborhood. And so I think those are some examples of tangibly what peace building what I've seen happen as a result of our work.
I know there's a couple questions, but I'm going to just jump in because it kind of dovetails to my question. Talking about trust and civil society, when we think about some of these communities, maybe the entire structure of society has been, so degraded that there isn't a lot there to work from. So how do you build up civil societies, and also how do you rebuild trust in these situations? That seems like the hardest part of some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of what peace building is trust building, to reestablish trust after decades of war. And so trust going both ways. I mean, trust with community leaders who've never had a public official show up, never have had access to security or justice. And community leaders who've seen like fumigating planes going by, dropping poison onto their crops. Like that is distrust. And on the other end of the spectrum, in the context of Colombia at least, where maybe police or military saw communities who were living in these municipalities as sympathizers of the FARC, and they were just in the crosshairs. And so if your police is distrustful of you and you're distrustful of the police, like how can you ever get back to a point where you're like, someone robbed something at my store, I want to go to the police and like denounce that crime and see if I can get justice for that. And so I think there's a lot of reconciliation that has to happen, maybe explicit or implicit, in a lot of the processes that we do at USIP. I was giving an example earlier to a student group that in one process that we had with the women mediators, we had one woman who was a victim of the armed conflict. She was a survivor of sexual assault. And in our group of women mediators, we also had a woman who was ex-combatant. So she had demobilized from her armed group. And so maybe this woman who had demobilized wasn't necessarily the same group or the person who victimized this other woman. And our process was about learning mediation skills. But through that dialogue that we had, where you had to recognize the humanity in the other and say, like, this is why I went to join an armed group. It's because I was poor, I was illegally recruited, and like this is the only option I had. And when you start seeing the humanity in the other, I think that's where a lot of trust can start being built. Trust also has to be earned in a lot of these contexts, but I think that that's the hard work, is like recognizing the humanity in the other person to start rebuilding that trust and rebuilding that social fabric. Hi.
And sometimes I stutter a bit if I'm asking a question that I really don't want to pin you on this thing, but because it's important what you do. It's amazing. It's needed stuff. But this is going to be a question leading towards Russia and China. As you see, like in Africa, their influence is huge, and I think like their peace might be more in the negative end of things, if there is any peace involved with their influence, but they're heavily influential as they're switching governments there. As I move into Latin America, i.e. China into Chile, Russia into Venezuela, whereas they're not focusing on necessarily, my guess, I don't know it as well, climate, gender stuff. They're just dealing with straight up money and who's in power. That their influence just hands down knocks out the other one, and they know it. Like some people know it, but or is that just my perception on the outside that we don't talk about it that way because it's so important to have the other stuff in the long run? But you're seeing these, like Africa is just an example of it right now.
Mm-hmm.
So your take on China and Russia's how they're might be doing their piece
Yeah,
in these countries now too.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a USIP and at other places like USIP, we've been talking a lot, I think, over the past couple of years about the great powers of China and Russia and what that means for global stability writ large. And, you know, there was a time when the US was the big player. It was the like power holder in all of these contexts, but that's has since evolved, right? And I think there has to be there is a recognition that that paradigm has shifted. So I'm not as familiar with the African continent, though my colleague here is, and maybe she can share more of her insights. But I think, you know, what we see, you know, China's Belt Road Initiative in Latin America, right, deeply investing in infrastructure in countries like Bolivia, like Chile, or Russia and Iran playing a role with like crude oil in Venezuela. And so what they're doing is exerting some sort of economic leverage to get these countries to be like, well, the US isn't doing anything for us, so like let's go with these players. They're offering us economic incentives or infrastructure that's going to, you know, better our livelihoods. But I think what the US should be doing, I don't know if it is doing well, but is really reminding countries about democratic values and principles, of the importance of transparency, of accountability, of responsibility, of inclusion and participation. Like, I think that should be the conversation that the US government is thinking about. Like, it's no longer this massive power player, maybe. Maybe it doesn't exert the same sort of influence it did previously, but what we offer as a nation are values and principles. And so I think we have to make sure that that message is well received, because I think that that's the foundation of successful democracies.
Hi, I really admire the work that you're doing, especially with women and especially with Afro-Latina women in Colombia. I just want to ask how, like with so many places and communities that do need help for peace building, how does the USAP identify which communities to approach? And once they enter those communities, how do they identify which women that they're going to approach and elevate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in Colombia, there were, out of the peace agreement, there were 170 municipalities that were prioritized that needed immediate kind of support and stabilization once the FARC demobilized. And so, you know, there's a whole map of what that looks like. And Colombia has historically had a really robust civil society that had been working on these issues for decades. And so also having another map of what those organizations and civil society organizations look like, and you can kind of transpose that and be like, so we're going to Convención in Catatumbo on the border between Colombia and Venezuela. What are the organizations that are working there, civil society organizations, local organizations? And so that mapping exercise and knowing your context is super, super important. But I'll also say that in some ways, we had a project a few years ago on multi-stakeholder dialogues, and we wanted to work on the Pacific coast of Colombia that had been prioritized by the peace agreement. And so we started doing that mapping exercise. We're like, okay, so we can talk to these groups and this association of women and this victims group and whatever. And so when we first started going there and we were trying to get to this municipality, the social groups, the social leaders were saying, like, please don't come. It puts us too much at risk for USIP to be here. We want to like learn and support and be a part of this process, but it's too much of a risk for us. And so we pulled out. We were like, we can't do the work in a way that's safe for them. And so we had to leave that community, unfortunately. But this is the type of kind of analysis and strategic thinking that has to go along with the types of programs and processes that USIP can do, but it also has to be locally led. Like, can it happen in this municipality? Or is this Columbia has had historic USAID support for a lot of years. And so you also have to think, like, has this place been oversaturated by international development? Like, am I just duplicating things here? And so I think these are like the questions that you have to ask yourself before you begin any program.
I was talking in my criminal justice class, we were talking about juries and senators and stuff. I was thinking about the political field and what this has to do with women. And if I go like to like the police academy, can I do, after I do that for some time, can I go into the political career like you guys?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question, but you're asking like for your own career path?
Yeah.
Like if you decide to go into the police academy, if you can go transfer into...
Yeah, like after I'm done like doing police work for a couple years, because I like want to get in political too.
Yeah, I would say yes. I think that the security sector, whether that's police or through the military, offers a really important perspective on peace and security.
And how can I do that? Like get like where like you guys, where can I start like to start my political career after doing some time in my schooling?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can do like internships, whether it's with NGOs or organizations like USIP, or going to Capitol Hill, or working for your local state legislature here. I think internships are a good way for you to start understanding how that kind of constellation of organizations and political representation work. And then that can give you kind of a better sense of where you want to end up kind of down the road in your career.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Sad.
No, you can stay seated.
Okay, how does your type of organization like USIP and everything? That was a great word too, by the way. But how does your type of organization handle very complex issues like in Russia? Like, is there a peacekeeping organization or any type there, or is that a country that really doesn't believe in peacekeeping, despite everything that's been going on over there? You know what I mean? So how would your type of organization help, or would that not be a thing? Would it be more of a risk? You would say?
Yeah, so I think with the invasion of Ukraine, the way in which USIP is supporting that process is to provide kind of technical advice to the Ukrainian government, to Ukrainian civil society, to the security sector, to reconciliation efforts. So it's to religious engagement, it's like a very multi-pronged approach to supporting the Ukraine effort. I work a lot on social movements and civil society participation. And so Ukraine has historically had large social movements in the past. And in Russia, there have been kind of signals of anti-war resistance. And so, I mean, in that context, it's really hard to do that sort of movement because of repression, imprisonment, and intimidation, and other factors like that. So I'm not an expert on Ukraine or Russia by any means. And so I think there are different ways and at different levels to support that ongoing process.
Just maybe a follow-up. When you are engaging in dialogue at a grassroots level, and you have spoilers, people who are really there to derail, they're not interested in the process at all.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really going to engage, but because you want to have as many stakeholders as possible there in the room,
Mm-hmm.
how do you deal with that, or how do you try and neutralize
Mm-hmm.
participants who really aren't being very productive to the
Mm-hmm.
process?
Yeah, so we had a multi-stakeholder dialogue process that was ongoing in Colombia in 9 different municipalities to hold mapping exercise, like who are the women's groups and youth groups and associations in each of these places, and what are their security issues and needs and justice needs. And so we knew that even though we try to protect that dialogue and be really intentional about who we were convening and inviting, we knew that that information would likely get leaked to maybe armed groups that were operating in that area. And so we had to know that there would likely be people from armed groups coming and joining those dialogue sessions just to hear, just to see what people were saying, like for better, for worse. And so we knew that that was a possibility. And so like sometimes when you're working with civil society, like, you know, they've tried to be part of these processes for so long, they have such high expectations, but at some point they just get exhausted and they're like, why aren't you showing up? You know, the frustration really comes out. And so our dialogues were around civil society and then local security and justice, so like police or the attorney, like the local attorney general, the justices of that region, like coming together to be like, listen, like what you're doing around security and justice isn't working for us. Can you please change X, Y, and Z? And so, you know, making sure that those local officials came to those dialogues was really hard. For the police to just show up to a dialogue was really hard. And they weren't necessarily spoilers, but they were like, what is the incentive for me to be here? I'm just doing my job and like, I'm going to get paid no matter what. And so maybe there are spoilers at the national level, right, in national peace processes that do not want it to advance for different reasons, economic reasons or otherwise. But at the local level, I don't know if necessarily they're spoilers, but maybe people who aren't as dubious, because people want like immediate results. They're like, okay, let's get to this. You're going to pave the road, like do it tomorrow. And so I think that's the major issue that you run into in a dialogue and at the local level.
I guess I'm just trying to figure out. So you guys assist in Venezuela and everywhere else. So once you guys get things established or in a direction, so it assists the other country. Like who pays for that, and how are you guys getting that done? Is that something that U.S. citizens pay for? Like, I'm just trying to figure all that out as well.
Yeah. So the U.S. Institute of Peace is funded by the American taxpayer. So all of our programs are funded through your taxes. So thank you. But it's also the State Department and USAID and all of these other agencies are also funded through the American taxpayer. That being said, USIP's operating budget in any given year is around $50 million.
Of taxpayers' dollars?
50 million taxpayer dollars, which is not insignificant. But when we're talking about defense or state or aid, they're working on $1 billion of a yearly budget. And so like, you know, sometimes we joke, we're like, $50 million, that's how much like a propeller of a Black Hawk costs, you know? I mean, it's trite, but it's also like, we can do a lot with very limited budget. And we hold ourselves accountable to Congress for saying how we've spent that money. And Congress is your elected official. And so we do recognize the value of what that means for the work that we do. And so we are very judicious, I think, of how we spend our money. And we also can work with other agencies to support their programming efforts.
I have a question for you, Tonis. You are the daughter of the Colombia diaspora, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me as I look around the room that some of us are children of the diaspora. We are diasporic, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts or guidance about the role in which those of us who are have origins, our parents have origins in areas of conflict. Is there a role for us?
Yeah.
And generally, what are your thoughts on efforts around diaspora and diaspora communities helping to, even though they may be miles away,
Mm-hmm.
helping to contribute to resolving conflict?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think that, I'm a daughter of immigrants. I felt really compelled by my parents' history in Colombia and my family's history in Colombia to do the work that I do. But that also, sometimes you feel a distance, right? Like when I was growing up, Colombia was over there. I was on a playground, having a very happy and normal life. And so as I grew older, though, and felt a responsibility, like a very deep responsibility to be like, this is a country that my parents came from. My entire identity is around this country. Like, what can I do to help it? To like add my little grain of sand into its process. And so, I feel a deep responsibility for the issues that I care about in Colombia and in Latin America. I also identify as a Latin American woman, not just a Colombian woman. And so I think that if you feel compelled by social justice issues, about inclusion, about grievances, if you're a part of a diaspora community, there are ways to support it even from afar, whether that's just if you can contribute to an NGO and offer, some financial support, if you can volunteer, maybe, when we had the fall of Kabul, there was a massive outpouring of Afghans in DC there to support resettlement. And so I think there are different ways that you can support your community from afar. And again, I think I felt personally that deep responsibility to give back from whatever position I could. And I think I said this earlier, like if you are committed to those things, if you want to be a change agent, then you are probably a peace builder and probably want to do peace building work. And so I think we all have a role to play in creating a more just and peaceful world, whether that's in Grand Rapids, Michigan, or if that's in a rural town in Colombia.
It's a wonderful place to end. Let's thank Tonis and Max for leading us in this conversation. Outstanding. Thank you so much. What a great way to spend the International Day of Peace.
Yeah.
And talking about it, and the fact that you're all here, I'm sure you're all about peacemaking and peace building, and we'll be looking to see what you do in that regard.